We're back, and I'm happy to say an update is here. I want to share some experience and knowledge learned since my original video. In my first vermicomposting video, I explained a basic how-to and shared some important facts. I'm here now to add to those tips and facts and share some of the things I've learned since. This video is an addition to my original video, but it can be helpful on its own. I'll start out with my perspective on worm casting use, some video of our gardens, and how much you can do with worm castings in regular compost. Over the last couple years, I've had 4 to 5 active vermicomposting bins. Right now I'm set at 4 and feel like this works fine for now. I have room for 1 or 2 more if I deem necessary. In my case, I use these castings as soil amendments in our various gardens, which can be seen here and in my other videos. Hopefully I'll have more to come. My use case may be different than yours, but my garden or light farming square footage can always use more castings. Between an 8x8 outdoor composting pit and these worm castings, I've been able to turn and keep soil fertile enough to stay away from chemical fertilizers. Staying organic is not something I'm adamant about, I just enjoy the fact that I can do it myself. Currently we have about 5,000 square feet where we grow crops and another 2,000 square foot orchard. The orchard doesn't get many castings, but the annual fruits and veggies do. I typically apply a handful with every new planting. I'm here to say that composting and vermicomposting castings alone can suffice for those size gardens once you stabilize the soil to begin with or get it to the proper organic state. 5,000 square feet of crops is no little thing. Compost and castings can maintain the annual nutrient drain from growing crops, which was a personal challenge for me when we started this. Now we'll look at my current setup. Right now they've been left alone for a few weeks. It turns out I should have looked last week as they were low on food and water. Life happens. While I talk about my process, I'm going to show typical maintenance for these bins that I do 1 or 2 times per month. Usually a little water, food, and turn it over to let the settled moisture circulate and put the dry surface areas on the bottom corners where more moisture will accumulate. A couple of these bins are near 4 months old and a couple maybe 2 months old since they've been redone or transplanted. Note the glove is on, not because I think it's gross, but because the humic acid, or worm humus, the worms produce, while great for soil and plants, actually makes it pretty tough to wash off your hands. I found the ideal place to store them is in our basement utility room. They prefer a stable, dark, and quiet, vibration-free environment. We have some hard winters in the northern US, so in-home temperatures are a must for year-round activity. If you're doing it correctly, there is zero odor. A properly functioning vermicompost bin has a light scent of earth, and that's about it. Vermicomposting can be pretty easy if you continue to offer the right environment, which is really the only hard part to it. I want to hit on the main components to make vermicomposting work right now. The proper bedding, proper amount of food, proper moisture content, and proper temperature. Add in the right amount of space and you'll have a good amount of castings, and they will continue to breed as long as they have the space. Redworms breed only if they feel they have the space and food available to do so. They are self-sufficient at their own population management. For bedding material, I still feel clean, tape, sticker, and dye-free shredded cardboard is unbeatable, especially in today's Amazon society. They are everywhere. It's a 2 birds with 1 stone approach. Bed and feed for worms and microorganisms, and it gets rid of your boxes. Using leaves or dead grass will rot and smell. Grass clippings are notorious for mold and rot. The shredded boxes aren't a food alone, but they do absorb a lot of liquid from the decaying, which in turn makes them more palatable to microorganisms and therefore the worms. I did end up upgrading my shredder since the last video. I got a used 12-sheet shredder, and that has absolutely no issue with doing cardboard shredding. It just hastens the process for me. After the bedding, food is on the menu. I'd say no more than 1/4 of the bin should be food scraps at a time. Be sure to bury the green matter, food scraps, to keep away fruit flies or any smells. If the scrap is hard, it will help a lot to chop it up a little bit. Like say carrots would take a long time to break down. Anything listed in my other videos for composting will work. Just avoid anything that will have an obvious odor like onions. I've learned the worms love squash. Butternut, spaghetti, pumpkins are the biggest hits I've found. They love it. That might not be easy for some, as I grew a trailer load last year, so always have a few extra, but once they start to soften and the bacteria starts to break it down, the worms will swarm underneath and devour it, leaving behind just the skin. When it comes to food waste, just be sure to remove all the seeds. Years ago, the first time I did this, I was putting whole squash in the worm bin, and all the seeds were still in there, and by the next season when I went to go use the castings, there were so many seeds in it that I couldn't tell the difference between new seeds and the seeds in the compost, and they were just sprouting everywhere, and it was a nightmare. They all looked the same, all seedlings look the same typically until they start to mature, so it was bad news. So hopefully you guys can learn from my mistake. The wider the variety you put in with the worms, the better your vermicompost will be. Be sure to put in some grit as well, as it helps the worms process their food, as they don't have stomach acids to break foods down like humans do. Baked and sterile crushed eggshells and used coffee grounds work great. Baking the shells means there's nothing to rot and smell. I've also started using clean sawdust from building projects. Just be sure it's not treated lumber. Next up we have moisture levels, a very important point. You want it to be damp but not wet. This can be a little tricky, as you saw earlier in the video with all the air conditioning on right now, but it can be tricky as heated or air conditioned houses will take out moisture at varying rates. If it's really wet, you'll get rot and odor, and the worms will suffer, and then your production rates are really bad. So if it's a little too wet, you'll actually get an exploding population of very little white bugs called springtails. They're typically harmless and live alongside your worms, helping to break down composting material. If you keep your moisture levels right, though, their numbers should be held at a moderate amount rather than a seemingly endless horde. They're so small that my first experience with them, it took me a few minutes to realize what I was seeing. Yes, the carbonated fizzing look is just a ton of small, really small, white bugs jumping around. Rest assured they aren't bad though. I hurried to research that myself, but again, they can be kept under control with the right amount of moisture. Last but not least, temperature control for these guys seems to work out perfectly for living among humans. They, like us, get cold below 50 degrees Fahrenheit and too hot above the mid 80s Fahrenheit. Either of those extremes can be damaging to them, so keep that in mind. They like a temperature around 68 degrees, just like we typically do, meaning a dark area in your climate-controlled home will work perfectly. I've also learned it's a good system to put their production on an annual cycle. Remove castings before growing season and give them all new bedding and food sources, essentially reset the bin. This gives them another year to be maintained and occasionally fed while breaking down the entire bin again to be ready for harvest before the next planting season. I've done it this way for the past 2 years and it's worked really well. That's about a 4 to 5 gallon bucket full of castings per bin every season. Assume a handful per planting and you've got a lot of firepower there. At the least, you'll just want to make sure that before you're going to want to use the castings that you don't have a bunch of new food and bedding in there, or it's just going to be a nightmare to try to get the castings out when it's so congested. If you're interested in expanding your operation, adhering to the guidelines in this video should fully populate your bin. Then, because these worms are typically community-based, you should be able to find clusters of these worms near food sources, and it should be easy to grab a handful to move. Anytime you transplant these guys to a new environment, leave a light on so they know home is down. They can and will crawl out sometimes. They'll also try and leave if the worm bin isn't right, but again, if you follow the steps above, you'll have no issues. I rarely even put a lid on these things. A little castings can go a long way. A handful with a seedling or around some new seeds is an obvious improvement in growth rates. I've even used worm castings to mend pretty bad looking plants. It is a fantastic catch-all soil conditioner. These blueberry bushes are a perfect example. I moved these from another property and put a few handfuls of worm castings in and a little bit of iron chelate, and these are just the results after a couple months. Here in August, the bins have been going from fresh for a few months or so. Before next spring, when they are about done, maybe I'll do a video about the best ways to extract castings, taking effort and cost into account. Hopefully this video was helpful to you.